Tonight, we're going to talk about a city that Rome tried to wipe off the face of the earth. A city that once rivaled Rome itself. A city whose ships dominated the Mediterranean, whose merchants grew fatter than kings, and whose gods demanded things that even other ancient peoples found a little bit uncomfortable. A city that was burned, salted, cursed, and then quite deliberately forgotten. Carthage. If you want to understand why Rome became Rome, you need to understand the empire that Rome had to destroy in order to get there. Not the ruins, not the tourist site, but the living, breathing rival that once stood on the other side of the sea and had a very good chance of winning. We begin a 10-part series today about the history of Carthage, told strictly in chronological form. So I advise that you take it one day at a time. We can follow along together. And each day we can approach a different chapter of this story, from its Phoenician origins on the coast of Lebanon, through its rise as a merchant superpower, into the long and bloody wars with Rome, and finally to that famous ending where the city was leveled, and its name became a byword for total destruction. Before we begin, let me just thank everyone on Patreon and YouTube memberships for supporting, keeping everything ad-free, and those who donate, check out the merch store, but also to those who take the time to click the like button, the subscribe button, and leave a little comment. Helps push us out in the algorithm. Anyway, with all that being said, let's begin part one of our history of Carthage. Now, to understand Carthage, you cannot start at Carthage. You have to start somewhere else entirely. You have to start on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, in what today we would call Lebanon, in a string of ancient port cities pressed between the mountains and the sea. Because Carthage was not, at least in the beginning, an African city. It was a colony, a daughter city, an outpost of a people we call the Phoenicians. And those Phoenicians, well, they are one of the more fascinating peoples of the ancient world. Not because of their armies, they didn't really have much of one, and not because of their monuments, which have largely disappeared, but because of their ships and their commerce, and the fact that they, more or less invented the alphabet that eventually became the letters that I'm reading off my page right now. Not a bad legacy for a people that most folks these days couldn't point to on a map. The Phoenicians called themselves something like the Canaani, the Canaanites, and they occupied a stretch of coastline dotted with independent city-states. Byblos, Sidon, Berytus, Arwad, and above all Tyre. These were not a unified nation. They were more like a loose association of merchant republics, each one governed by its own king and its own council of wealthy families. They squabbled with each other. They occasionally cooperated. And they collectively figured out something that would change the ancient world, which was that if you have limited farmland, but you have very good harbors and very good timber, that is Lebanese cedar, then maybe you don't need to conquer your neighbors. Maybe you just need to sell to them. By around 1200 BCE, give or take, the eastern Mediterranean went through what we call the Late Bronze Age collapse. Huge civilizations fell. The Hittite Empire was gone. Egypt was hanging on by its fingernails. Mycenaean Greece was reduced to villages, and the whole system of palace economies just, imploded. Now, normally in history, when everything collapses, that's very bad news for everyone. But sometimes, in a collapse, opportunities open up. And the Phoenicians, sitting in their coastal cities with their ships intact and their trade networks still functioning, well, they were perfectly positioned to fill the vacuum. Into the wreckage of the old world they sailed, and what began as a modest coastal trade turned into something extraordinary. Over the following centuries, Phoenician ships would go further and further west, into waters that no one from the eastern Mediterranean had ever really explored before. They set up trading posts on Cyprus, then on Crete, then in Sicily, in Sardinia, in the Balearic Islands, along the coast of North Africa, all the way to Spain, and eventually even past the Pillars of Hercules, that is the Strait of Gibraltar, into the open Atlantic. Some sources suggest they even circumnavigated Africa, though we can argue about that for hours if you'd like. Point is, these were sailors, serious sailors. They knew the stars, they knew the winds. They knew how to build a ship that could survive a bad night in the open sea, and along the way they founded colonies. Little Phoenician outposts, each one a piece of home planted in a foreign land. And of all those colonies, by far the most famous, by far the most important, was going to be a place they called Carthage. the new city, and in Latin, well, that comes out as Carthago, Carthage. Now, the founding of Carthage is one of those stories where legend and history sit uncomfortably next to each other. Traditional dates give us 814 BCE, which is what the Romans and later Greek historians would settle on, but archaeological evidence at the site suggests activity a little bit later than that, perhaps closer to the mid-8th century. So somewhere in the 800s BCE, on the coast of modern Tunisia, a group of settlers from Tyre arrived and began building a city. Now, why did they leave? Well, that's where the legend gets involved. And even if the legend is not literally true, it is worth telling because it is the story that Carthaginians themselves would tell about themselves for centuries. The legend goes like this. In the city of Tyre, there was a princess. Her name was Elissa, though the Romans would later know her as Dido. She was the daughter of a king, and her brother was Pygmalion, who inherited the throne. Elissa was married to a wealthy priest named Asabas, and Pygmalion, being one of those unpleasant royal siblings that history is absolutely lousy with, decided that he wanted Asabas's money. So he had him murdered. Elissa, understanding perfectly well that her brother would probably come for her next, gathered a group of loyal followers, along with, in some versions of the story, the treasure that Pygmalion had been after, and she fled by ship. They sailed west. First to Cyprus, where they picked up more followers, including in some tellings priestesses to serve as wives for the men, and then further west still until they reached the coast of North Africa, where the local Berber king, a fellow named Iabas, offered them a piece of land. But not just any piece of land. He said, and this is the story, she could have as much land as could be covered by the hide of a single ox. Now, Iabas thought he was being clever. He was thinking, well, that'll get her a little farmhouse and a stable maybe. But Elissa, well, Elissa was clever too. She had the ox hide cut into extremely thin strips, laid end to end, and used those strips to encircle an entire hill. And that hill would become the Biasa, the citadel of Carthage. Biasa, by the way, is a Greek word meaning ox hide. So the etymology holds together, at least in the story. The Carthaginians told this tale for centuries. Whether it is literally true is a completely different question. What we can say from archaeology is this. Sometime in the 9th or 8th century BCE, Phoenician settlers established a city on a peninsula that jutted out into the Bay of Tunis, on the coast of modern Tunisia. And they picked their spot with the eye of people who really understood shipping. Because this location, well, it was almost too good to be true. You had a defensible peninsula. You had 2 natural harbors that could be developed. You had fresh water from local sources. You had access to fertile agricultural land inland. And most importantly of all, you were sitting right at the choke point of the entire Mediterranean, where the sea narrows between North Africa and Sicily. Any ship going from the eastern Mediterranean to the western Mediterranean, or the other way around, was basically forced to pass within striking distance of your harbor. That is not an accident. That is a business plan carved into geography. In the early days, Carthage was not yet the great power it would become. It was one Phoenician colony among many. Utica, actually, which was a bit older and a bit further up the coast, was arguably more important in the beginning, and Carthage still looked to Tyre as its mother city. Colonists sent tribute back east. They maintained religious ties. Their chief gods were the gods of Tyre. Melkart, the patron god of Tyre, whose name literally means king of the city. Baal-Hamon, a chief male deity. Tanit, a goddess who would become uniquely important to Carthage. These were Levantine gods, brought across the sea in the hearts of homesick settlers, and they would be worshipped in Carthage for hundreds and hundreds of years. The early city, though, would have looked pretty modest to our eyes. Mud brick houses, narrow streets, a harbor lined with wooden jetties. A temple on the Acropolis, warehouses full of goods being packed and unpacked, ships coming in and going out. It was a merchant town. That was its identity from the beginning, and that would remain its identity right up until the end. The Carthaginians were not, at least not for a long time, empire builders in the traditional sense. They didn't march legions into foreign lands to plant their flag on someone else's palace. What they did was trade. They bought low and they sold high. They connected markets that had never before been connected. They moved tin from Britain, silver from Spain, ivory from Africa, purple dye from their own coast, wine, olive oil, grain, slaves, glass, textiles, everything. And they got very, very rich doing it. But being a rich merchant city in the ancient Mediterranean was, well, it was a bit like being a fat merchant walking through a bandit-infested forest. Everyone was looking at you. And so, as Carthage grew, as the wealth accumulated, as the ships multiplied, the city would eventually have to answer a very old question. How do you defend what you have built? And the answer that Carthage came up with, well, that is where the story truly begins to get interesting. So, we left off with Carthage as a modest merchant town on the coast of North Africa, one Phoenician colony among many, sitting on a spectacular piece of real estate, but not yet the great power it would become. Now, to understand how Carthage transformed from a colonial outpost into an empire in its own right, we have to look at what was happening back in the old country, back in Phoenicia proper, because the fate of the mother cities on the Lebanese coast would ultimately determine whether Carthage remained a daughter colony or became something else entirely. And spoiler, it became something else entirely. Not by choice, mind you, but by necessity. Because the eastern Mediterranean, well, it was about to get very unpleasant for the Phoenicians. You see, starting around the 9th century BCE, a new power was rising in Mesopotamia. And when I say a new power, I mean the kind of power that made everyone else in the ancient Near East, extremely nervous. That would be the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Now, the Assyrians were, let's put it this way, not known for their gentle diplomatic touch. They were known for building an army that was more or less unstoppable, and then using that army to extract tribute from anyone within reach. And Tyre, that great merchant city on the Lebanese coast, well, it was within reach. Assyrian kings began demanding tribute from the Phoenician cities. Silver, gold, timber, ships, sometimes even the daughters of the ruling houses. The Phoenicians paid up mostly, because paying up was cheaper than being besieged. But every so often, one of the cities would refuse, or would fall behind on payments, or would try to play the Assyrians off against Egypt. And then, well, the Assyrian army would show up outside the walls and things would get very grim indeed. Now, Tyre, unlike most cities, actually had a natural defense that the Assyrians struggled with. Tyre was built on an island just offshore, and the Assyrians, whatever else they were not sailors. They could ravage the mainland. They could burn the vineyards. They could enslave the farmers, but they couldn't quite get across that little stretch of water to the island itself. So Tyre held out longer than most, but holding out is expensive. And you can imagine that a lot of Tyrians, looking at their tribute payments, looking at their burning countryside, looking at the Assyrian banners on the horizon, might have started to think that maybe, just maybe, the future of their people lay somewhere else. Somewhere far to the west, somewhere the Assyrians couldn't reach, somewhere like, I don't know, that promising little colony their ancestors had founded on the coast of North Africa. And that's exactly what happened. Over the course of the 8th, 7th, and 6th centuries BCE, waves of refugees, merchants, priests, and colonists made the journey west. Carthage's population grew, its wealth grew, its shipbuilding capacity grew, and crucially, its independence grew too. Because when Tyre was finally reduced by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II in the early 6th century, after a siege that lasted, according to some sources, 13 years, well, the umbilical cord connecting Carthage to its mother city was effectively cut. Tyre was still there, but it was diminished. It could no longer meaningfully command its western colonies. And Carthage, sitting there in its splendid harbor with its accumulated wealth and its growing fleet, well, Carthage was on its own. And Carthage, seemed to think that was just fine, thank you very much. By around 550 BCE, give or take, Carthage was no longer a colony. It was a power in its own right. And it was doing something that would define its entire political existence, which was gathering up the other Phoenician colonies in the western Mediterranean and organizing them into a kind of loose confederation with Carthage at the center. Utica, Hadrumetum, Gads in Spain, colonies in Sardinia, colonies in Sicily, colonies on the Balearic Islands, all of these places, which had been founded by Tyre or Sidon or Byblos, now looked to Carthage as their protector, their leader, their commercial hub. This was not an empire in the Roman sense. There were no Carthaginian governors sitting in every city collecting taxes. It was more of a network, a federation, a trading system with Carthage as its beating heart. And that suited the Carthaginians just fine, because Carthaginians, like their Phoenician ancestors, were merchants first and everything else second. Now, at this point, I should probably tell you a little bit about how Carthage was actually governed, because it was, actually quite interesting, and in some ways, weirdly modern. Carthage was not a monarchy, at least not in the classical sense. It had had kings in its very early days, but by the 6th or 5th century BCE, it had evolved into what we might call a merchant republic. There were two chief magistrates called Suffites. That word comes from the same Semitic root as the Hebrew word shofet, which you might recognize as judge, as in the Book of Judges in the Old Testament. The Suffites were elected annually from among the wealthy families and served roughly the function that Roman consuls would later serve in the Roman Republic. There was a Senate, or Council of Elders, made up of the heads of the great merchant houses. There was a smaller inner council of 30 or so who handled the day-to-day executive stuff. And there was also, at least in theory, a popular assembly where ordinary citizens could vote on major matters, though in practice, the wealthy elite ran the show pretty much all the time. The Greek philosopher Aristotle actually admired the Carthaginian constitution. He wrote about it in his Politics and considered it one of the better designed political systems of his day, though he did note, with characteristic Greek snobbishness, that it perhaps put a little too much emphasis on wealth as a qualification for office. Well, Aristotle, yes, it did, but it also produced a state that lasted for centuries and dominated the Western Mediterranean, so maybe wealth as a qualification wasn't the worst filter in the world. In any case, this republican system was quite different from what most of Carthage's neighbors had. The Berber kingdoms of North Africa were monarchies. The Greek cities of Sicily were sometimes democracies, sometimes tyrannies, but almost never anything as stable as what Carthage had. Only the Roman Republic, when it eventually emerged, would have anything comparable. And that similarity, well, we'll get to why that matters later. Now, what powered all of this? What made Carthage rich enough to fund fleets and armies and colonies and temples? Trade. It was always trade. Let me give you a picture of what a Carthaginian merchant fleet was actually doing in a typical year. A ship would leave the harbor of Carthage loaded with goods produced in North Africa, grain from the fertile plains around the city, olive oil pressed from the groves that stretched inland, wine. Textiles dyed with the famous Tyrian purple, that fabulously expensive dye extracted from the murex sea snail, which was worth literally more than its weight in gold. Pottery, glass beads, manufactured goods of all kinds. That ship might sail west along the North African coast to Gades, which is modern Cadiz in Spain, where it would trade for silver mined in the Sierra Morena Mountains. That silver was the real prize. Spain in this period was the Saudi Arabia of silver. Vast, almost incomprehensible quantities of it were being pulled out of the ground by mines that the Carthaginians came to control. And whoever controlled Spanish silver, well, that person could pretty much dictate terms to the entire Mediterranean economy. From Gades, the ship might continue north through the Pillars of Hercules and up the Atlantic coast, seeking tin, which was needed to make bronze, and which came ultimately from Cornwall in southern Britain, though the Carthaginians were extremely secretive about exactly where the tin was coming from. There's a famous story about a Carthaginian captain who was being followed by a Roman ship trying to learn the route to the Tin Islands. The Carthaginian, rather than reveal the trade secret, deliberately ran his own ship aground and wrecked it on the rocks. He got compensated by the Carthaginian government when he made it home, because losing a ship was worth it to protect a monopoly. Now that is dedication to the cause. Or from Carthage, ships might sail east to Egypt and the Levant, trading in the ports that their ancestors had left. Or they might go north to Sicily and Italy, or further to Greece itself. Or south along the African coast, into waters that no one else in the Mediterranean world knew anything about. Carthaginian sailors reached, we think, at least as far as modern Senegal, possibly further. The city itself, well, it grew and grew. By the 5th century BCE, Carthage was probably one of the largest cities in the Mediterranean world, with a population that some estimates put at several 100,000 people at its peak. The two harbors were engineered to a level of sophistication that stunned visitors. There was a commercial harbor, rectangular, packed with merchant ships from every corner of the known world. And behind it, connected by a channel, was a circular military harbor, absolutely brilliant piece of engineering, with berths for hundreds of warships arranged around a central island where the Admiralty had its headquarters. This inner harbor could be closed off, and enemy scouts approaching Carthage from the sea couldn't actually see how many warships were inside because the whole thing was walled off. It was, in effect, a hidden navy, and when it deployed suddenly in overwhelming numbers from what looked like nowhere. The city was also protected by walls that ran for something like 33 kilometers in total, with triple defenses on the landward side and stables built into the walls themselves for war elephants and horses. That's right, war elephants. The Carthaginians had them. We'll get to that in later parts. But suffice it to say, when Greek and Roman travelers described Carthage, they described a city that was almost unimaginably wealthy, almost unimaginably fortified, and almost unimaginably confident in its own supremacy. The temples on the Biasa hill glittered with gold. The markets buzzed with a dozen languages. The docks never stopped moving. And in the countryside surrounding the city, the great agricultural estates of the Carthaginian nobility produced surpluses of grain and wine that made those same nobles even richer. But there was a shadow over all of this splendor, and that shadow had a name. Well, actually, it had several names, because Carthage, as it grew into a great power, was going to run into other great powers. And the Western Mediterranean, well, it just wasn't big enough for all of them. The Greeks were pushing west, too, colonizing Sicily and southern Italy, and they had absolutely no interest in leaving the profitable Sicilian trade routes to a bunch of, in their view, dodgy Phoenician merchants who wouldn't even properly worship the proper Olympian gods. And a little bit further north, in a swampy patch of Italy, a small city-state was slowly, quietly, and with methodical patience beginning to conquer its neighbors. A city that Carthage had barely heard of. A city that would, one day, become its greatest enemy. And that story, the story of the collision between Carthaginian sea power and Greek colonial ambition, and the shadow of Rome beginning to grow in the background, well, that is where we're heading next. So, we've got Carthage now standing on its own 2 feet. Wealthy beyond measure, independent from its Phoenician mother cities, sitting at the crossroads of the Mediterranean with a merchant fleet that could reach from Britain to the Levant and a military harbor that could hide an armada in plain sight. And now, we come to the part of the story where Carthage stops being just a rich trading city and starts becoming a genuine imperial power. Because being rich attracts enemies, and Carthage was about to acquire quite a few of them. The first and most persistent of those enemies, well, they weren't Romans, not yet. We'll get to those chaps eventually. The first great rivals of Carthage were the Greeks, and to understand why, we have to talk about a piece of land that will be fought over for centuries. Sicily, that triangular island sitting just off the toe of Italy, a place so strategically important that whoever controlled it more or less controlled the central Mediterranean. Now, Sicily in the Archaic period, that is roughly the 8th to the 6th centuries BCE, was a bit of a mess in the best possible sense. It had native populations, the Sicels in the east, the Sicani in the center, the Elymians in the west. It had Phoenician colonies clustered on the western coast, places like Motia, Panormus, that's modern Palermo, and Salunto. And it had Greek colonies, lots and lots of Greek colonies, scattered along the eastern and southern coasts. Syracuse, Gela, Acragas, Selinunt, Messana, and a dozen others. Now, when the Greeks first started colonizing Sicily around 750 BCE, the Phoenicians were already there, but there was enough room for everyone. The island's actually quite large, and the initial settlements were spread out along different coasts. So for a while, Phoenicians traded with Greeks, Greeks traded with Sicels. Everybody sort of got along, or at least didn't fight all the time. But as the colonies grew, as the populations expanded, as the profitable trade routes became more valuable, well, the inevitable started to happen. They ran out of room. And in the ancient world, when people run out of room, they don't have a nice civilized conversation about zoning. They fight. By the 6th century BCE, tensions were rising. Carthage, having taken over the leadership of the Western Phoenician colonies, now saw itself as the protector of Motia and Panormus and the other Phoenician settlements. And when a Greek adventurer, a fellow named Dorius, tried to establish a Greek colony right in the middle of what Carthage considered its sphere of influence in western Sicily around 510 BCE, well, Carthage sent troops. Dorius was killed. His colony was destroyed. And Carthage had, more or less, drawn a line in the sand. Everything west of that line, Phoenician. Everything east of it, well, Greek, sure, whatever you like, but don't cross the line. That kind of arrangement, of course, only holds as long as both sides find it convenient. And in 480 BCE, one side decided it wasn't convenient anymore. Now, 480 BCE. That year should ring a bell for anyone who knows a bit of Greek history. Because that's the year that the Persian king Xerxes invaded Greece with an absolutely enormous army. That's the year of Thermopylae, of the 300 Spartans, of the naval battle at Salamis, where the Greeks pulled off one of the most improbable victories in military history. Well, at the same time as all of that was happening in the Aegean, something similar was happening in Sicily. Because Carthage decided, and this is where it gets interesting, that with all the mainland Greeks distracted by the Persians, it was the perfect moment to expand Carthaginian influence in Sicily. A Carthaginian army, reportedly commanded by a general named Hamilcar, though this is not the famous Hamilcar we'll meet later, sailed to Sicily. Some ancient sources say the army was 300,000 men strong, which is almost certainly a wild exaggeration. Ancient chroniclers loved their big numbers, but it was definitely a huge force, drawn from all across the Carthaginian Empire. Libyans, Iberians, Sardinians, Corsicans, Balearic slingers, all fighting under Carthaginian command. They landed at Panormus and marched east against the Greek city of Hymera. And this was going to be the moment where Carthage would establish itself as the master of Sicily. Except, well, it didn't quite work out that way. The Greek tyrant of Syracuse, a man named Gelon, along with his ally Theron of Acragas, brought a Greek army north to meet the Carthaginians. And at the Battle of Hymera, on what tradition says was the very same day as the Battle of Salamis, though that's probably a nice literary flourish added later, the Carthaginian army was crushed. Hamilcar himself was killed. Some accounts say he threw himself into a sacrificial fire when he realized the battle was lost. Others say he was cut down in the fighting. Either way, the Carthaginian expedition was a disaster. The army was destroyed. The fleet was burned. And Carthage was forced to pay a massive indemnity to the victorious Greeks and to accept, humiliatingly, that Greek Sicily would remain Greek. For Carthage, Hymera was a wake-up call. The Carthaginians retreated to lick their wounds, and for about 70 years, they largely stayed out of Sicilian affairs. They focused instead on their African possessions, on expanding their control over the interior of what is now Tunisia and Algeria, on developing their trade routes to Spain and beyond. This was, in fact, one of the most productive periods of Carthaginian history. Because during those 70 years, Carthage did something that most people don't associate with the Carthaginians at all. They became farmers. Or rather, they became agricultural landlords, and really impressive ones too. The Carthaginian countryside, called by later Romans the Chora, became one of the most productive agricultural zones in the ancient Mediterranean. Great estates worked by Libyan peasants and slaves produced grain, wine, olives, figs, pomegranates, and almonds on a scale that would eventually make Rome itself dependent on North African food imports. There was a Carthaginian writer named Mago. We don't know exactly when he lived, probably around the 4th or 3rd century BCE, who wrote a massive 28-book manual on agriculture. Everything from how to plant your olive trees to how to manage your slaves to what to do about pests and how to make wine. Mago's work was so respected that when Rome finally destroyed Carthage, the Roman Senate specifically ordered that Mago's agricultural treatise be preserved and translated into Latin. Everything else in the Carthaginian libraries was burned or given away, but Mago's book was saved because the Romans, Hard-headed, practical people that they were, recognized that it was too useful to lose. Unfortunately, even the Latin translation is now lost, and we only know about Mago's work through quotations by later Roman writers. But those quotations suggest that Carthaginian agricultural science was extraordinarily sophisticated. Crop rotation, soil management, irrigation, animal husbandry, all developed to a level that Rome would later study and imitate. So, agriculture, trade, and administration, that was Carthage's business in this 70-year peace. But Sicily, as we said, was too tempting to leave alone forever. And by the late 5th century BCE, opportunities were opening up again. The Greek cities of Sicily had spent the intervening decades fighting each other, as Greek cities tended to do. Syracuse had grown enormously powerful under a series of tyrants, but the smaller Greek cities resented Syracusan dominance, and some of them started looking at Carthage as a potential ally against Syracuse. And Carthage, was more than happy to oblige. In 409 BCE, a Carthaginian army returned to Sicily, this time under the command of Hannibal Mago. And no, that's not the famous Hannibal either. We're going to have to be patient about that one. This Hannibal was the grandson of the Hamilcar who died at Himera, and he was reportedly quite eager to avenge his grandfather's defeat. Well, he got his chance. His army sacked the Greek city of Selinunt, which was besieged for just 9 days before its walls were breached and its population massacred. Then he marched on Himera itself, the site of his grandfather's disaster. He took it, and once he had it, he did something that shocked even the ancient world. He rounded up 3,000 Greek prisoners and had them ritually executed on the exact spot where Hamilcar had died 70 years earlier. Blood for blood. That was Carthaginian justice, at least in this case. The war with Syracuse dragged on and on. New Carthaginian expeditions came and went. Cities were taken, cities were lost. Plague broke out in the Carthaginian camp on more than one occasion, wiping out entire armies. The Syracusan tyrant Dionysius I, a fascinating and terrifying character in his own right, fought Carthage to a standstill and even invaded Carthaginian territory in western Sicily. The border between Greek Sicily and Punic Sicily shifted back and forth. Nobody really won, but Carthage did manage to hang on to its western Sicilian possessions, which was the important thing. From a Carthaginian perspective, the goal was never to conquer all of Sicily. The goal was to keep control of enough of Sicily to protect the trade routes and to prevent any single Greek power from dominating the island. And that goal, more or less, was achieved. Meanwhile, back in Africa, Carthage was dealing with a problem that would plague it for its entire history: the Berbers. Or, as the Carthaginians called them, the Libyans, though that's a slightly misleading term because it referred to all the various native peoples of North Africa, not just those in what we now call Libya. These were the original inhabitants of the region. The Carthaginians had settled among them, traded with them, and eventually subjugated large portions of them, extracting tribute and labor and military service. The Berbers, weren't always happy about this arrangement. Every so often, they'd revolt. Sometimes small revolts, sometimes very serious ones. Carthage always had to keep one eye on its African subjects, because a Berber rebellion could threaten the city itself if things got out of hand. And more than once in Carthaginian history, they did get out of hand. The Carthaginians also had a slightly awkward relationship with the Numidian kingdoms to their west and south. The Numidians were Berber kingdoms too, but organized under kings rather than tribal confederations. They provided some of the finest light cavalry in the ancient world, and they served in Carthaginian armies for centuries. But they were also independent kingdoms with their own interests. And when Numidian kings started to feel that Carthage was getting a bit too big for its boots, well, they would sometimes make life difficult. This tension between Carthage and the Numidians would become extremely important in the final chapters of Carthaginian history, when a Numidian king named Massinissa would play a crucial role in Carthage's destruction. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, in the 4th century BCE, Carthage was riding high. Sicilian wars aside, the empire was expanding, the treasury was full, the fleet was unmatched. And across the sea, in a swampy little corner of central Italy, A city that Carthage had barely noticed was slowly, methodically, and with extraordinary discipline beginning to unify the Italian peninsula under its control. The name of that city, of course, was Rome. So, Rome. That's where we need to turn our attention now. Because everything that Carthage was doing, all that trade, all that agriculture, all those wars with the Greeks in Sicily, it was all going to be overshadowed eventually by what was happening on a swampy patch of land in central Italy. And it's worth spending a moment here to appreciate just how unlikely the whole thing was. If you'd been a Carthaginian merchant in, say, 400 BCE, and someone had told you that within 200 years your city would be a smoking ruin, because of the actions of some Latin-speaking farmers from a hilltop settlement on the Tiber, well, you'd have probably laughed. You'd have poured them another cup of wine and told them to lay off the strong stuff. Because in 400 BCE, Rome was a nobody. Rome had just barely survived being sacked by the Gauls in 390 BCE. Rome was one of several competing powers in central Italy, and not even the strongest one. But Rome had a few things going for it that nobody at the time really appreciated. It had a political system that worked. It had a culture that emphasized discipline and duty above almost everything else. It had a population that reproduced itself reliably. And it had, an absolutely bottomless appetite for war. Now, the first contact between Carthage and Rome was, believe it or not, quite friendly. The two cities actually signed treaties with each other, several of them, in fact. The Greek historian Polybius, writing a couple centuries later, tells us about the earliest of these treaties, dated to 509 BCE, which is the same year that traditional Roman history says the Roman monarchy was overthrown and the Roman Republic was founded. Now, some modern scholars have questioned that date, thinking it might be a little too neatly coincidental, but the treaty itself is real enough. It was a commercial agreement. Carthage promised not to harm Roman ships as long as they didn't sail into certain restricted areas. Rome promised not to interfere with Carthaginian trade in Sicily or Africa. It was a nice, sensible, mutually beneficial arrangement between two powers that had absolutely nothing to fight about. Rome was busy conquering its Latin neighbors. Carthage was busy fighting Greeks in Sicily. Their spheres of interest didn't overlap, so they got along fine. More treaties followed, one in 348 BCE, renewing the commercial arrangement with a few additional clauses, another in 306, which some scholars debate, but which seems to have divided the Western Mediterranean into Roman and Carthaginian spheres of influence. And then another one in 279 BCE, which was actually a mutual defense pact against a common enemy. And who was that common enemy? Well, that would be a fellow named Pyrrhus, Pyrrhus of Epirus. And Pyrrhus is one of those characters in ancient history who deserves a little bit of attention because he actually gives us a preview of what the collision between Rome and any other major power would look like. Pyrrhus was the king of Epirus, which is a region in northwestern Greece, and he was a distant cousin of Alexander the Great. He was also considered by many of his contemporaries to be one of the greatest generals of his age. Second only to Alexander himself, some said. He was ambitious, he was talented, and he was itching for a big war. In 280 BCE, the Greek city of Tarentum in southern Italy got into a squabble with Rome and asked Pyrrhus for help. Pyrrhus said yes, and he sailed across the Adriatic with an army that included, and this is important, 20 war elephants. Now, the Romans had never seen war elephants before, never even heard of them really. And when Pyrrhus's army met the Roman army at Heraclea in 280 BCE, the elephants, they did what elephants tend to do. They terrified the horses, they trampled the infantry, they caused chaos. Pyrrhus won the battle. But he lost so many of his own men in the process that he supposedly said, "Another victory like this, and I am undone," which is where we get the term Pyrrhic victory, a victory so costly that it might as well have been a defeat. Pyrrhus won a second battle against Rome at Asculum in 279, again at heavy cost. And then, he got a message from Sicily. The Greek cities, they were being pressed hard by Carthage, and they wanted him to come save them too. So Pyrrhus took his army across to Sicily and started fighting Carthaginians. He actually did pretty well at first, drove the Carthaginians back to their western strongholds, besieged the fortress of Lilybaeum, which was the main Carthaginian base in western Sicily, almost pushed Carthage entirely out of the island. And this is the moment when Carthage and Rome signed that mutual defense treaty in 279 BCE. Because both of them were losing to Pyrrhus, and they figured, well, if we can't beat him separately, maybe we can beat him together. It's a very sensible sort of thinking. In the end, though, Pyrrhus never managed to finish either job. He couldn't take Lilybaeum. His Greek Sicilian allies got tired of his high-handed manner and started deserting him. He went back to Italy and lost a decisive battle against Rome at Beneventum in 275 BCE. Then he sailed home to Greece, where he was eventually killed in a minor skirmish in Argos by, of all things, a roof tile thrown by an old woman. Ignominious end for one of the great generals of the age, but there you go. The Pyrrhic War, though, had two very important consequences. First, Rome had proven that it could stand up to a Hellenistic army led by one of the best generals of the era. Rome was no longer just a regional power. It was a serious military force that the wider Mediterranean world had to take seriously. And second, Rome now controlled all of the Italian peninsula. The Greek cities of southern Italy, which had been independent for centuries, were now Roman allies, or Roman subjects, depending on how you looked at it. That meant Rome now had a coastline on the Ionian Sea and the Tyrrhenian Sea. Rome now had ports. Rome now had access to shipbuilding materials and Greek naval expertise. Rome, in other words, was suddenly a Mediterranean power. And the moment Rome became a Mediterranean power, its interests started to overlap with the interests of Carthage. And the moment their interests overlapped, well, the friendship that had lasted for 200 years was going to come to a very abrupt end. And it came to that end, as these things so often do, over something almost trivially small. Now, in Sicily, on the northeastern tip of the island, there was a city called Messana, modern Messina. It sits right on the strait that separates Sicily from Italy, and whoever holds Messana controls one of the most important choke points in the whole Mediterranean. In the 280s BCE, Messana had been seized by a group of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines. These were absolute rogues. They had been hired by the tyrant of Syracuse to serve as bodyguards, and when their contract ran out, instead of going home like decent people, they marched into Messana, killed the men, took the women, and set themselves up as the new rulers. Not exactly gentlemen, but that's the ancient Mediterranean for you. For a couple of decades, the Mamertines ran Messana as a kind of pirate state, raiding their neighbors and generally causing havoc. Well, eventually the new tyrant of Syracuse, a very capable man named Hiero II, decided that enough was enough. He marched an army against Messana in the late 260s BCE, defeated the Mamertines in battle, and had them under siege. The Mamertines, facing extermination, panicked. And in their panic, they did something absolutely foolish. They split into two factions and appealed for help to two different powers. One faction appealed to Carthage. The other faction appealed to Rome. Now Carthage responded quickly. A Carthaginian garrison entered Messana and installed itself in the citadel, effectively taking control of the city. That should have been the end of it, but the Rome-favoring faction of Mamertines was not satisfied. They wanted the Carthaginians out, so they sent their appeal to Rome, and the Roman Senate found itself in an extraordinarily awkward position. On the one hand, helping the Mamertines was, morally speaking, indefensible. These were mercenaries and murderers who had illegally seized a city. On the other hand, if Rome refused, then Carthage would end up controlling Messana, which meant Carthage would control the strait, which meant Carthage would have a foothold on the doorstep of Italy itself. The Senate debated, and couldn't come to a decision. So, in an unusual move, they punted the question to the popular assembly, and the people voted to intervene. In 264 BCE, a Roman army crossed the strait into Sicily and marched on Messana. The Carthaginian garrison, made the extraordinary mistake of withdrawing without a fight. The Carthaginian commander, a fellow named Hanno, evacuated the citadel rather than risk a battle with the Romans. When he got home, the Carthaginian government was so furious that they had him crucified. Because now, with the Romans in Messana, Carthage had lost its foothold. and the 200-year friendship between Rome and Carthage was over. What began as an intervention on behalf of some pirate mercenaries had just started what would become the longest and bloodiest war of the ancient world. The Romans called it the First Punic War because they called the Carthaginians the pony, meaning Phoenicians, and from that Latin word we get the English adjective Punic. And this war, ladies and gentlemen, was going to last for 23 years. Now, let me set the scene for you as it stood in 264 BCE, because the two combatants were, well, they were not exactly evenly matched, at least not on paper. Carthage had the greatest navy in the world, hundreds of warships, highly trained crews, advanced shipbuilding technology, skilled admirals with generations of experience. Rome, by contrast, had almost no navy at all. A few small ships used mostly for coastal patrol, no serious warships, no real naval tradition. Rome was a land power, plain and simple. Carthage had the wealth of the Mediterranean trade behind it. Rome had the tax revenues of Italy, which were considerable but nothing like Carthaginian wealth. Carthage had a professional army of mercenaries drawn from across its empire. Rome had a citizen militia, the legions, drawn from the Italian farming population. On paper, this should have been a Carthaginian walkover. Carthage should have used its navy to blockade the Italian coast, cut Rome off from Sicily, and starve the Romans into submission. That's not what happened. What happened instead is one of the most astonishing stories of military adaptation in the ancient world. Because Rome, faced with a naval enemy, did something that nobody expected. Rome decided to build a navy, from scratch, in the middle of a war, against the greatest naval power in the Mediterranean. And well, that story, the story of how Rome learned to fight at sea and how Carthage discovered that its greatest advantage could be neutralized by sheer Roman stubbornness, is where we're heading next. So the year is 264 BCE. The First Punic War has just begun, and Rome has a problem, a very large problem, because Sicily, where this war is going to be fought, is an island. And to fight a war on an island, you need ships. And Rome, well, Rome doesn't really have any ships to speak of. Meanwhile, Carthage has hundreds of warships and a naval tradition going back centuries. Any sensible analyst in the ancient world looking at this situation would have bet on Carthage, heavily, and they would have lost their money. Because what Rome did next was, well, it was frankly a bit mad, and it worked. According to the Greek historian Polybius, who is our main source for the Punic Wars, and who is actually one of the best ancient historians we have because he interviewed people who had been there and had access to Carthaginian records that have since been lost. According to Polybius, the Romans acquired a Carthaginian warship that had run aground on the Italian coast. And they copied it, board by board, rib by rib. They took the thing apart and rebuilt it as a template, and then they started churning out copies. Within, according to some accounts, 60 days, they had built a fleet of 100 quinquiremes, which were the standard heavy warship of the era, and 30 triremes. Now, 60 days is almost certainly an exaggeration. You can't build 100 warships in 60 days, even with unlimited resources. But whatever the exact timeline, the Romans did build a fleet with astonishing speed. And here's the thing. They knew their ships would be inferior to Carthaginian ships. They knew their crews would be inferior to Carthaginian crews, so they came up with a trick, a very Roman trick. They invented a device called the corvus. Corvus is Latin for raven or crow. It was a boarding bridge, about 11 meters long, mounted on a swivel on the ship's foredeck. At the end of the bridge was a large iron spike shaped like a bird's beak. When a Roman ship got close enough to a Carthaginian ship, the corvus would be dropped, the spike would drive into the enemy's deck, and suddenly the two ships were locked together. And now the fight wasn't a naval engagement at all. It was a land battle happening on wooden platforms floating in the ocean. And Roman legionaries, on a stable platform, they were the finest close-quarters fighters in the Mediterranean world. Carthaginian sailors and marines going up against Roman legions in a boarding action they lost. They lost pretty consistently. The first major test came at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE off the northern coast of Sicily. The Roman fleet under Gaius Duilius met a Carthaginian fleet, and thanks to the corvus, they won a stunning victory. 50 Carthaginian ships captured or sunk. Duilius came home to a hero's welcome, and Rome erected a column in his honor decorated with the bronze rams of captured Carthaginian ships, the Columna Rostrata. It was a psychological turning point. The Carthaginians had assumed the Romans would never be a naval threat. Suddenly, the assumption was wrong. And the war just kept going, and going, and going, for 23 years, because both sides, once committed, absolutely refused to give up. Let me try to give you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about here. This was, until World War I, the bloodiest war in human history in terms of combat losses. Rome lost, by some estimates, over 700 warships during the course of the First Punic War, most of them not in battle, but in storms, because Roman ships were heavier than Carthaginian ships, thanks to the corvus and other modifications, and they didn't handle rough weather well. In 255 BCE, a Roman fleet returning from a failed invasion of Africa was caught in a storm and lost, according to Polybius, over 280 ships and something like 100,000 men. That's one storm. That's one afternoon of bad weather at sea. 100,000 men gone. Just, gone. In 253, another storm, another 150 ships lost. In 249, yet another storm, another 120 ships. Rome kept building fleets and the sea kept swallowing them. But Rome kept building. And that right there is the difference between Rome and Carthage, because Rome could just keep going. It had the manpower, it had the taxpayer base, it had the fanatical political will. Carthage had the money, sure, but Carthage was a merchant republic, and merchants tend to get nervous when the balance sheet keeps showing losses. There were some remarkable episodes during this war. In 256 BCE, Rome actually launched an invasion of Africa itself. A Roman army under the consul Marcus Atilius Regulus landed in North Africa and began marching on Carthage. The Carthaginians panicked, sued for peace, and Regulus, drunk on his own success, demanded terms so harsh that the Carthaginians rejected them and decided to fight on instead. Which turned out to be a smart move, because Carthage then hired a Spartan mercenary general named Xanthippus who was, actually rather good at what he did. Xanthippus reorganized the Carthaginian army, added war elephants and a much stronger cavalry force, and in 255 BCE at the Battle of Tunis, he crushed Regulus's army. Regulus himself was captured, and according to the legend, later sent to Rome to negotiate a peace on parole. He was supposed to have advised the Roman Senate to reject the Carthaginian terms, and then, honorably, returned to Carthage to be tortured to death for his advice. Modern historians think most of that story is later Roman propaganda, but it made for a good tale, and generations of Roman schoolchildren were taught it as an example of pure Roman virtue. Meanwhile, in Sicily, the fighting ground on and on. Every city was fought over multiple times. Agrigentum was besieged, taken, retaken, and its population sold into slavery. The Carthaginians held onto their western Sicilian strongholds at Lilybaeum and Drepana, and the Romans besieged them for years without being able to take them. It was a Carthaginian general named Hamilcar Barca who arrived in Sicily in 247 BCE and conducted a brilliant guerrilla campaign from a mountain stronghold called Irkt, and later from another one called Eryx, raiding Roman positions and refusing to let his army be pinned down. Hamilcar Barca, by the way, remember that name, because Hamilcar had a son, a young boy at this point, whose name we're going to hear a great deal about in the second half of this series. But that's for later. For now, Hamilcar was tying down large Roman forces in western Sicily, and he was not losing his war. He wasn't winning either, but he wasn't losing. The war finally ended in 241 BCE at the naval battle of the Aegates Islands off the western coast of Sicily. The Romans, having yet again rebuilt their fleet, largely through public loans from wealthy citizens who patriotically volunteered to fund warships out of their own pockets, caught a Carthaginian relief fleet heading for Lilybaeum and destroyed it. The Carthaginian fleet was undermanned, undertrained, and heavily laden with supplies for the besieged garrison. It didn't stand a chance. 50 ships sunk, 70 captured, and Carthage, financially and militarily exhausted, finally sued for peace. The terms were harsh but not annihilating. Carthage had to evacuate Sicily. Carthage had to pay a massive indemnity to Rome, 3,200 talents of silver over 10 years, which was a truly enormous sum. And Carthage had to release all Roman prisoners without ransom. Rome got Sicily. It became Rome's first overseas province, the first piece of territory Rome had ever governed outside of the Italian peninsula. The Roman Empire, in the sense we usually mean the term, effectively began in 241 BCE with the acquisition of Sicily. Now, this was bad enough for Carthage. Losing Sicily was a bitter blow. Paying the indemnity was going to strain the treasury for a decade. But what happened next was, in some ways, even worse than the war itself. Because Carthage now had to figure out what to do with its mercenary army, and that army was not happy. It hadn't been paid regularly during the war. Money had been in short supply. The soldiers had been promised bonuses and back pay that had never materialized. And now, with the war over, they were shipped back from Sicily to Africa, expecting to finally get what they were owed. And Carthage tried to negotiate them down. Tried to offer them less than what had been promised. And the mercenaries, drawn from all across the Mediterranean, Libyans, Iberians, Gauls, Balearic Islanders, Greeks, even some Italians, they decided that they had had quite enough of being cheated by their employers. They revolted. What followed is known as the Mercenary War, or the Truceless War, and it lasted from 241 to 238 BCE. And it was, if you can believe it, even more brutal than the Punic War that had just ended. Because there were no rules, no exchange of prisoners, no ransoms, no pretense of civilized conduct. When one side captured members of the other, they tortured them to death and displayed the bodies. When the Carthaginians finally caught the two main leaders of the rebels, a Libyan named Matho and a Campanian named Spendius, they crucified Spendius in front of the walls of Tunis. The rebels responded by torturing to death 30 Carthaginian prisoners they held. It was a war of pure vengeance, waged with a savagery that even the ancients found shocking. The historian Polybius, who was not exactly a squeamish man, called it the most impious and bloody war in history. Carthage came very close to losing. The mercenaries, who knew Carthaginian military techniques intimately because they had spent decades using them, blockaded the city itself. The Libyan population of North Africa rose up in support of the rebels, seeing a chance to throw off Carthaginian rule. Utica and Hippo Regius, two of the oldest Phoenician cities in Africa, actually defected to the rebels. Carthage was fighting for its very survival, cut off from its African hinterland, its treasury exhausted, its allies wavering. And who saved Carthage? Well, that would be our old friend Hamilcar Barca, the general who had held out in Sicily. He was recalled from retirement and given command of what was left of the Carthaginian army. And Hamilcar was one of those extraordinary military talents that appears every so often in history. He waged a campaign of maneuver and stratagem against the rebels, trapping their main force in a mountain valley and starving it into surrender. He beat them, methodically, ruthlessly, and by 238 BCE the revolt was crushed. Hamilcar was, at that moment, the most powerful man in Carthage. But while Carthage had been distracted by the mercenary war, something very ugly had happened. Rome, watching Carthage bleed, decided that this was the perfect moment to grab a little more territory. And Rome just took Sardinia, just took it. There was no legal justification. There was no provocation. Roman envoys arrived in Carthage, while Hamilcar was still finishing the mercenary war, and demanded Sardinia and an additional 1,200 talents of silver. And Carthage, exhausted, broken, unable to fight another war, Carthage had to agree. And this act, this shameful bit of Roman opportunism, this piece of pure political theft, it planted a seed of hatred in the heart of Hamilcar Barca that he would pass on, quite deliberately, to his son. And that son is where our story goes next. So Sardinia is gone, Sicily is gone, the treasury is empty, the mercenaries are dead or dispersed, and Carthage, humiliated and diminished, is trying to figure out what comes next. Now, in most stories, this would be the point where a defeated power just quietly accepts its new reduced status and settles into a comfortable irrelevance. And Carthage certainly had that option. It could have contracted back to being a merchant republic on the coast of North Africa, minding its own business, doing its trade, staying out of trouble. It probably would have survived for a long, long time if it had made that choice. But Carthage, or rather one very particular Carthaginian family, decided not to make that choice. Because Hamilcar Barca, that brilliant general who had held out in Sicily and then crushed the mercenary rebellion, Hamilcar Barca had other plans. He had watched Rome cheat his city out of Sardinia. He had watched the Roman Senate humiliate Carthage while it was too weak to resist. And he had decided, with a kind of cold, calculated hatred, that he was going to rebuild Carthaginian power somewhere else, and that when Carthage was strong again, he was going to make Rome pay for what it had done. The place he chose was Spain. Now, Spain, or Iberia as the ancients called it, was already partly Carthaginian. The old Phoenician colony at Gads, modern Cadiz, had been under Carthaginian influence for centuries. The silver mines of the south had been feeding the Carthaginian economy for generations. But the interior of the peninsula was largely unexplored by the Carthaginians and populated by various Celtic and Iberian tribes who lived in fortified hilltop settlements and they were quite good at war, but quite bad at getting along with each other, which meant that a determined outsider with a good army could potentially carve out an empire there. And that's exactly what Hamilcar Barca set out to do. In 237 BCE, just a year after the humiliation over Sardinia, Hamilcar took an army to Spain. He took his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair with him, and he took his 9-year-old son. And before they left, according to a famous story preserved by the Roman historian Livy, Hamilcar made his young son swear an oath at the altar of Baal, an oath of eternal hatred against Rome, that the boy would never be a friend of Rome, would never rest until Rome was destroyed. And that boy was Hannibal. Now, we should probably talk about the Barca family for a moment, because they are going to dominate the next 50 years of Carthaginian history. Hamilcar had 3 sons that we know of: Hannibal, the eldest, Hasdrubal, the middle, and Mago, the youngest. The Roman historians, writing centuries later, called these 3 the lion's brood, and they meant it as a compliment and a curse at the same time, because these 3 young men, raised in Spain, tutored in Greek warfare and Carthaginian statecraft, and their father's implacable hatred of Rome, they were going to shake the Mediterranean world to its foundations. But first, Hamilcar had to build the base, and that took the better part of a decade. From 237 to 229 BCE, Hamilcar campaigned relentlessly in southern and eastern Spain. He subjugated tribes. He built alliances. He founded cities. He seized silver mines. And gradually, methodically, he assembled a private empire that had technically no connection to the Carthaginian state at all. This is important, because the government back in Carthage, dominated by a peace faction that wanted nothing more to do with wars and was quite happy paying its indemnity to Rome and going back to being a merchant republic, the government did not really control what Hamilcar was doing in Spain. Hamilcar wasn't sending his conquests back home as Carthaginian provinces. He was building a personal power base, funded by the silver mines, garrisoned by his own troops, loyal to him and his family, not to Carthage. The Romans, when they eventually noticed what was happening, called it the Barcid Empire, and they weren't wrong. Hamilcar was building something that looked more like a Hellenistic kingdom than a Punic colony. And when he died in 229 BCE, drowned in a river while retreating from a battle against a Spanish tribe that had ambushed his army, his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair took over. Hasdrubal was more of a diplomat than a warrior. He founded the city of Carthago Nova, New Carthage, which is modern Cartagena in Spain, and made it his capital. He married the daughter of a Spanish chieftain to cement local alliances. He negotiated a treaty with Rome in 226 BCE, the Ebro Treaty, which set the Ebro River as the northern boundary of Carthaginian influence in Spain. Rome would stay out of anything south of the Ebro. Carthage would stay out of anything north of it. Nice, tidy, sensible. Except for one small city that the Romans had made an alliance with called Saguntum. Saguntum was south of the Ebro. Well, south of it, actually, deep in what should have been Carthaginian territory. Nobody thought much about it at the time, but Saguntum was, Saguntum was going to be the flashpoint. And in 221 BCE, Hasdrubal the Fair was assassinated by a Celtic slave whose master he had executed, and the command of the Spanish army passed to the eldest son of Hamilcar Barca. To Hannibal himself, who was now 26 years old, and who had spent his entire adult life in Spain, in his father's camps, in his father's army, dreaming of the day when he could finally do what his father had promised the gods he would do. Now, let me stop for a moment and try to tell you about Hannibal as a person, because he's going to dominate the rest of this series, and it's worth understanding him a bit. The ancient sources, both Roman and Greek, are almost unanimous in describing him as one of the greatest military commanders in the history of the world. And they had every reason to downplay him if they could, because he was Rome's enemy and Rome wrote the history. But they couldn't downplay him. He was too obviously brilliant. Livy describes him as a man of extraordinary energy, absolutely fearless in danger, absolutely tireless in exertion, indifferent to food or drink or comfort, sleeping on the ground among his soldiers, dressed like an ordinary trooper. But also, Livy adds, cruel, treacherous, and impious, which is what you'd expect a Roman to say about the man who very nearly destroyed Rome. Polybius, who is more even-handed, portrays him as a general of extraordinary tactical genius, capable of adapting his tactics to any situation, and capable of holding together an army made up of Libyans, Iberians, Gauls, Numidians, and Italians for 15 years of continuous campaigning in enemy territory. And he did this, mostly by force of personality. Because Hannibal spoke half a dozen languages, understood the customs of all his mercenary contingents, ate their food, respected their religions, and made sure they got paid on time. Which, given what happened after the First Punic War, was a lesson he had clearly learned very well. So, Hannibal takes command in 221. He spends 2 years consolidating Barcid control over southern Spain, campaigning against various tribes, extending the frontier north toward the Ebro. And in 219 BCE, he does something that he must have known would provoke a war. He besieges Saguntum, the Roman ally. Now, from a strictly legal standpoint, the Ebro Treaty didn't cover Saguntum. Saguntum was south of the Ebro, in what was clearly Carthaginian territory, and Saguntum had, according to Carthaginian sources, been attacking Carthaginian allies. So Hannibal had, in his view, a perfectly legitimate reason to intervene. Rome, of course, saw it differently. Rome saw a Roman ally being attacked by a Carthaginian general and demanded that Hannibal back off. Hannibal refused. Saguntum sent embassies to Rome begging for help. Rome sent embassies to Carthage demanding Hannibal be recalled. The Carthaginian government, dominated by the Barcid faction now, refused. The siege continued. It lasted 8 months. 8 months of horror, of starvation, of desperation, of hopeless resistance. When the city finally fell, the population fought street by street. Many of them killed themselves rather than surrender. Saguntum was sacked and destroyed. And Rome, its ally, massacred, its warnings ignored, formally declared war on Carthage. The Second Punic War had begun. And now we come to one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in the history of the world. Because Hannibal did something that nobody in Rome expected. He didn't wait for the Romans to come to him. He didn't defend Spain. He didn't hunker down and wait for a Carthaginian fleet to bring him reinforcements. He gathered his army, some 90,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry and 37 war elephants, and he marched. He marched east through Spain, crossed the Pyrenees into what is now southern France, marched east again along the coast, crossed the Rhone River, and then he turned north, into the Alps, in autumn, with elephants, the Alps, ladies and gentlemen. In October, with 90,000 soldiers and 37 elephants and all the baggage and pack animals of a mobile army. It's difficult, from our modern perspective, to convey just how insane this decision must have sounded at the time. The Alps were considered impassable. The passes were held by hostile Gallic tribes who resented any army marching through their territory. The weather was brutal, snow, ice, freezing rain. The paths were narrow, sometimes barely wide enough for a man to walk, let alone an elephant. And Hannibal did it anyway. He did it because he understood something the Romans didn't. He understood that if he marched by any conventional route, The Romans would meet him at the border and grind him down. But if he came over the Alps, from a direction nobody expected, he would arrive in northern Italy behind the Roman defenses, in the middle of the recently conquered Gallic territories, where the local tribes hated Rome and would rally to his banner. It took him 15 days to cross the Alps. He lost, according to some estimates, half his army in the crossing. Men died of exposure, of falls into ravines, of ambushes by local tribes, of sheer exhaustion. Elephants slipped on icy paths and tumbled to their deaths. When he emerged on the Italian side, in the plains of Cisalpine Gaul in what is now northern Italy, he had perhaps 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and a handful of surviving elephants left. He was in enemy territory, cut off from his base, outnumbered by Roman forces several times over. And he was about to teach Rome a series of lessons in warfare that Rome would remember for the next 600 years. Because Hannibal, having done the impossible by getting his army into Italy, was now going to do the impossible again. He was going to destroy Roman army after Roman army, in battle after battle, over the course of 15 years, in what would become the greatest military campaign of the ancient world. And Rome was going to have to reinvent itself from the ground up just to survive it. So Hannibal is in Italy, late autumn of 218 BCE. He's got a battered, exhausted army. He's lost roughly half his men and most of his elephants crossing the Alps. He's deep in enemy territory. And the Romans, once they figure out that Hannibal is actually in Italy and not still messing around in Spain, they mobilize with the kind of ruthless efficiency that made Rome, Rome. 2 consular armies are dispatched to deal with him. And this is where Hannibal begins the series of battles that would make his name echo for the next 2 millennia. Because Hannibal was not a general who fought the way anyone expected. He didn't line up his troops in a nice orderly formation and slug it out with the enemy. He used terrain. He used deception. He used the weaknesses of his enemies against them. And he used his multinational army, with its wildly different fighting styles, as a set of specialized tools rather than a homogeneous mass. The first real test came at the river Trebia in December of 218 BCE. The Roman consul Sempronius Longus, eager to win a quick victory before his term of office expired, took the bait when Hannibal's Numidian cavalry appeared outside the Roman camp early one morning. Sempronius roused his army, sent them out without breakfast, marched them through freezing water to cross the river, and drew them up in battle formation on the far bank. Hannibal, meanwhile, had fed his own men a hot breakfast, oiled their bodies against the cold, and hidden 2,000 men under his brother Mago in an ambush position along a stream bed. When the battle was joined, the Romans, cold, wet, hungry, and demoralized, held their center admirably. But then Mago's ambush hit them in the rear. Numidian cavalry crushed their flanks, and the Roman army disintegrated. Something like 20,000 Romans were killed or captured. Sempronius fled with a few thousand survivors. It was the first of many disasters, and it should have taught the Romans something. It didn't. The next spring, 217 BCE, Hannibal crossed the Apennines and marched into Etruria, into central Italy proper. The new Roman consul, Gaius Flaminius, followed him with an army. And Hannibal, understanding exactly what kind of man Flaminius was, impulsive, arrogant, contemptuous of his enemy, led him into another trap. This one at Lake Trasimene, a beautiful mountain lake in what is now Umbria. There was a narrow road running between the lake and the hills. Hannibal hid his entire army in the hills on a foggy morning and let Flaminius's army march directly into the ambush. When the trap sprang, the Roman army was strung out along the road with no room to form up. It was, quite frankly, a slaughter. 15,000 Romans killed, including Flaminius himself, 6,000 captured. Hannibal's losses were negligible, perhaps 1,500 men. Lake Trasimene remains, to this day, one of the largest ambushes ever successfully executed in military history. And Rome, receiving the news, went into a kind of collective panic. There were reports of women running through the streets tearing their hair, of the Senate convening in emergency session and staying in session all day, of the elderly Fabius Maximus being appointed dictator to deal with the crisis. Now, Fabius Maximus is worth pausing on for a moment, because Fabius did something that was, at the time, considered almost cowardly, but which turned out to be the only sane response to Hannibal. Fabius refused to fight him. He shadowed Hannibal's army, harassed his foragers, cut off his supply lines, but he refused, absolutely refused, to give battle. This was called the Fabian strategy, and from it we get the English word Fabian, meaning cautious, delayed, wearing down. The Roman public hated it. They wanted revenge. They wanted decisive victory. They called Fabius the cunctator, the delayer, and it was originally an insult. It only became a title of honor much later, after everyone realized that Fabius had been the only Roman general who had gotten Hannibal's measure and refused to play his game. But in 216 BCE, the Romans had had enough of delay. They elected two new consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, and they raised the largest army Rome had ever put in the field, something like 86,000 men. And they marched south to find Hannibal and, at last, to crush him. They found him near a small town in Apulia called Canna. And what happened at Canna is still studied in military academies around the world. Hannibal had perhaps 50,000 men against the Roman 86,000. He was outnumbered nearly 2-1. He was on flat, open ground where Roman infantry should have been at its strongest. Everything favored the Romans, and Hannibal did something that no general before him had ever attempted. He drew up his army in a crescent formation with the weakest troops, his Gallic and Iberian infantry, in the center, and his best troops, his Libyan veterans, on the wings. He placed his Numidian cavalry on the flanks, and when the battle began, he deliberately let his center get pushed backward. The Roman legions, pressing forward, thought they were breaking through. The crescent inverted, becoming a shallow U shape, with the Romans pouring into the pocket. And then Hannibal's Libyan veterans on both wings turned inward and closed on the Roman flanks, and his cavalry, having smashed the Roman cavalry, came around the rear and sealed the pocket. The Roman army, 86,000 men, found itself completely surrounded, in an area so tightly packed that many of the men in the middle couldn't even raise their weapons. And then Hannibal's men, working from the outside in, began the killing. The battle lasted the entire day. Some ancient sources say 70,000 Romans died. Modern estimates suggest 50 to 55,000, which is still, quite a lot. It's difficult to overstate what that death toll meant. In a single afternoon, Hannibal killed more Roman soldiers than would die in any single day of combat until World War I. Aemilius Paulus was killed. 80 senators died. 29 military tribunes. A significant portion of the entire Roman aristocracy gone in one afternoon. When the news reached Rome, the Senate literally did not know how to respond, because Rome had never, in its entire history, suffered a defeat like this. The city itself was largely undefended. If Hannibal marched on Rome immediately, there was very little to stop him. And this is where one of the most debated moments in ancient history occurs. Because Hannibal didn't march on Rome. He didn't try to take the city. His cavalry commander, Maharbal, is said to have urged him to march at once, saying, "In 5 days you will be dining in the capital." And Hannibal, according to the story, hesitated. And Maharbal, disgusted, said, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one." Whether the exchange actually happened, we don't know. But the question of why Hannibal didn't march on Rome after Canna has been argued about for over 2,000 years, and there's no really satisfying answer. His army was exhausted after the battle. He had no siege equipment. Rome was heavily fortified with the Servian wall. His strategy had never been to take Rome by storm, but to detach Rome's Italian allies and force Rome into a negotiated peace. Any of these might be true. All of them might be true. But whatever the reason, Hannibal didn't march. And Rome, given a breathing space, did something extraordinary. Rome refused to give up. The Senate, on hearing the news of Canna, formally decreed that there would be no negotiation with Hannibal, no ransoming of prisoners, no admission of defeat. Rome would fight on no matter the cost. They enrolled slaves into the army. They melted down temple treasures to fund new legions. They raised new armies. They quietly returned to Fabius Maximus's strategy of avoiding battle. And they simply refused to lose, even when losing looked inevitable. Hannibal, meanwhile, was doing what he had come to Italy to do. He was moving through southern Italy, encouraging Rome's allies to defect, and some of them did. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, went over to him. Tarentum went over. Various Greek cities and Samnite towns switched sides. But the core of Rome's alliance system, the Latin cities, and much of central Italy, they held firm. And that, in the end, was the fatal flaw in Hannibal's strategy. Because Rome's power wasn't just in the city of Rome. It was in the entire network of Italian alliances that Rome had built up over the previous 2 centuries. And that network, incredibly, held together under strain that would have shattered almost any other political system in the ancient world. So Hannibal was left with a strategic problem he couldn't solve. He could defeat any Roman army that faced him in open battle, but he couldn't take fortified cities without siege equipment. He couldn't get reinforcements from Carthage because the Romans dominated the sea. He couldn't crack Rome's alliance system, and he couldn't afford to just sit still because his army needed food and pay, and the Italian countryside, however rich, would eventually get stripped bare. For 15 years, Hannibal wandered up and down the Italian peninsula. He fought battles. He won most of them. He besieged cities, sometimes taking them, sometimes not. He tried to link up with his brother Hasdrubal, who was coming from Spain with reinforcements, but the Romans intercepted Hasdrubal at the Metaurus River in 207 BCE and defeated him. Hasdrubal was killed. His head was cut off and thrown into Hannibal's camp by Roman scouts. That was how Hannibal learned his brother was dead. And meanwhile, Rome was doing something clever. Rome was learning. Rome was studying how Hannibal fought. Rome was developing new tactics. Rome was training a new generation of generals who understood how to counter Hannibal's methods. And one of those young generals was a man named Publius Cornelius Scipio. He had fought at the Trebia when he was just 17 years old. He had survived Cannae, escaping with a small group of Roman soldiers. He had watched his father and uncle die fighting Carthaginians in Spain, and he had spent his young adult life studying Hannibal, learning from him, absorbing everything about how the greatest general in the world made war. And Scipio was going to be the one who finally figured out how to beat him. In 210 BCE, Scipio was sent to Spain to take command of Roman forces there, despite being only 25 years old, well below the legal age for such a command. He proceeded to systematically dismantle Carthaginian power in Spain. He captured New Carthage in a lightning strike in 209 BCE, coming from a direction the defenders hadn't thought possible. He defeated Carthaginian armies at Baecula in 208 and at Illyricum in 206. By the end of 206 BCE, Carthage had lost Spain forever. The silver mines, the recruiting grounds, the strategic base that Hamilcar Barca had spent his life building, all of it gone. And Scipio, now the most successful young general in Roman history, returned to Rome with a proposal that shocked the Senate. He wanted to take the war to Africa. He wanted to invade Carthage itself. And that is where the fate of Carthage was finally going to be decided. So Scipio's proposal to invade Africa. This was, in 205 BCE, an extraordinarily bold suggestion, because Hannibal was still in Italy, still undefeated on the battlefield, still, technically, an existential threat to Rome. And the older senators, the cautious ones, the veterans of the Fabian strategy, they thought Scipio was mad. Fabius Maximus himself, now in his 70s, gave a long speech in the Senate arguing that Scipio should stay in Italy and finish Hannibal first before doing anything else. But Scipio had figured out something that Fabius hadn't. Scipio understood that Hannibal was stuck, that Hannibal couldn't take Rome, couldn't detach Rome's core allies, couldn't be reinforced, and was, in effect, a wasp trapped in a room, dangerous but incapable of winning. The way to end the war was not to keep fighting Hannibal in Italy. The way to end the war was to threaten Carthage itself so directly that Carthage would have to recall Hannibal to defend the mother city. And once Hannibal left Italy, once he left Italy, he lost his advantage of terrain and initiative. He'd have to fight the way Rome wanted him to fight, on ground Rome chose. The Senate reluctantly gave Scipio permission to invade Africa, but they gave him almost no resources. They told him he could recruit volunteers. He could use the 2 legions that had been shamed at Cannae and were serving in Sicily in a kind of permanent exile as punishment for their defeat. But he couldn't have any new troops from Italy. It was, essentially, a way for the cautious faction to let Scipio try his plan while making it as difficult as possible for him to succeed. Scipio didn't seem bothered. He took his ragtag force to Sicily, trained them mercilessly for a year, and in 204 BCE he crossed to Africa. And here's where things get interesting. Because Scipio, unlike almost every Roman general before him, understood the power of diplomacy. Understood that you didn't have to defeat every enemy in the field. Sometimes you could turn them against each other. Specifically, Scipio worked on the Numidian kings. Remember the Numidians, those Berber cavalry masters who lived to the west and south of Carthage. For most of Carthaginian history, the Numidians had been Carthage's allies. Their light cavalry was the terror of the ancient world, and Numidian squadrons had been vital in Hannibal's victories at the Trebia and Canna. But Numidia wasn't one kingdom. It was two, at least. There was the eastern Numidian kingdom, called the Massilae, ruled by a young man named Massinissa, and there was the western Numidian kingdom, called the Massicili, ruled by an older king named Syphax. And these two kingdoms hated each other. Really, genuinely, murderously hated each other. Scipio, being no fool, played on this. He courted Massinissa, offered him alliance, offered him Roman military support in his ongoing dispute with Syphax. And Massinissa, seeing which way the wind was blowing, defected from Carthage and joined Rome. This was, in the long run, one of the most devastating things that ever happened to Carthage, because now the Carthaginians were fighting a two-front war on their own doorstep. Scipio's Roman army was one enemy. Massinissa's Numidian cavalry was another. And Carthaginian armies, which had traditionally relied on Numidian cavalry to screen their infantry and outmaneuver enemy forces, now had to fight without that crucial element while facing it in enemy hands. Scipio and Massinissa combined forces and began systematically defeating Carthaginian armies in the field. In 203 BCE, they destroyed a joint Carthaginian-Numidian force at the Battle of the Great Plains. Syphax was captured. His kingdom was handed over to Massinissa. And Carthage, panicked, did exactly what Scipio had predicted they would do. They sent urgent messages to Italy recalling Hannibal. Now, let me try to imagine what that must have been like for Hannibal. For 15 years he had been in Italy. 15 years of continuous campaigning. His army, which had once been a proud multinational force, was now a shadow of itself, reinforced by Bruttian and Lucanian volunteers, kept together mostly by his personal charisma. His father was dead. His two brothers were dead. His base in Spain was gone. His treasury was empty. And now his own government was telling him to come home to fight a defensive battle for the very existence of his city. According to Livy, when Hannibal received the news, he ground his teeth and groaned and almost wept. He had understood something the men in Carthage had not understood, that once he left Italy, the war was effectively over. But he was a soldier, and Carthage was calling, and so he came. He evacuated what remained of his army by sea from the port of Croton in southern Italy in the summer of 203 BCE. He was in his mid-40s now, no longer the young commander who had crossed the Alps, but a veteran of decades of war. And he was going home for the first time since he was 9 years old. The final confrontation came in October of 202 BCE at a place called Zama in what is now northern Tunisia. Hannibal versus Scipio, the two greatest generals of the age, facing each other across a battlefield with the fate of Carthage hanging in the balance. There is a story, preserved by Livy and Polybius, that before the battle the two men actually met, alone except for interpreters in the space between the armies. They talked. They looked at each other. They tried one last time to see if a negotiated peace was possible. Hannibal, apparently, offered generous terms. Recognized Carthage's defeat. Offered to accept Rome's supremacy in Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain. Just leave us Africa, he said. Just leave us the city and the coastal strip. Scipio, according to the story, replied that he could not accept those terms because Rome had already been offered them earlier and Carthage had violated the resulting truce. He could not, in effect, offer to Hannibal what he had already offered to Carthage and been refused. And so the two men saluted each other and returned to their armies, and the battle began. Hannibal drew up his army in 3 lines. In front, his war elephants, 80 of them, more than he had ever deployed. Behind them, his infantry, in 3 separate lines by ethnic and skill category. His mercenaries first, then his African levies, and finally, in the rear, the veterans he had brought back from Italy, the men who had fought with him for 15 years. It was a clever formation, and it might have worked against any general other than Scipio, because Scipio had prepared for the elephants. He had drawn up his own army in an unusual formation with corridors between the units, so that when the elephants charged, the Roman troops could simply step aside and let them pass through, then attack them from the flanks with skirmishers. It worked brilliantly. The elephant charge, which was supposed to shatter the Roman lines, instead just, it dispersed. Some of the elephants panicked and turned back on Hannibal's own men. Then the Roman and Numidian cavalry, under Massinissa, charged and drove Hannibal's cavalry off the field, which was exactly what Scipio wanted, because now Scipio's cavalry could do what Hannibal's cavalry had done at Cannae: come around behind the enemy infantry and complete the encirclement. The infantry battle was hard. Hannibal's veterans, the men from Italy, fought with the discipline of soldiers who had won every battle they had ever fought and knew this was the last one. But when Massinissa's cavalry returned to the battlefield and struck the Carthaginian rear, it was over. The Carthaginian army was destroyed. 20,000 killed, 20,000 captured. Hannibal escaped with a handful of horsemen and rode back to Carthage. And there in the Senate house, he did something that must have been extraordinarily difficult. He advised his fellow citizens to accept whatever terms Rome offered, because the war was lost, and any further resistance would just result in the destruction of the city. The Carthaginian Senate, chastened, sent envoys to Scipio to sue for peace. Scipio's terms were harsh, but this is important: they were not annihilating. Carthage would give up all its overseas possessions. Carthage would surrender its warships, all but 10 of them. Carthage would pay an indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver over 50 years, which was an even larger sum than the indemnity after the First Punic War. Carthage would recognize Massinissa's expanded Numidian kingdom, including any territories he claimed had once belonged to his ancestors. And crucially, Carthage would no longer be allowed to wage war outside of Africa without Roman permission. That last clause is the one that really killed Carthage's future. It didn't destroy the city. It didn't strip Carthage of its wealth or its trade or its independence in any obvious way. Carthage would go on being Carthage, but it would no longer be an independent great power. It would be, in effect, a Roman subject state, allowed to exist as long as it behaved. Some Carthaginians wanted to reject the terms and fight on. Hannibal himself, according to Livy, forcibly pulled one senator down from the rostrum when the man was arguing for continued war, and told him to shut up and let the adults negotiate. And the treaty was signed. In 201 BCE, the Second Punic War ended. Now, what happened next is one of the most interesting parts of the whole story, because Hannibal did not go quietly into retirement. Instead, he ran for political office. He was elected Suffete of Carthage, one of the 2 chief magistrates, and he proceeded to launch an aggressive program of political and financial reforms. He targeted the corruption of the Carthaginian aristocracy, the oligarchic council of judges who had run the city as a private club for generations. He reformed the tax system. He rooted out embezzlement. He made it possible for Carthage to actually pay the Roman indemnity on time without impoverishing itself. He was doing what his father had done in Spain, rebuilding Carthaginian power, but this time from the inside, through economic and administrative revival rather than military conquest. And the Carthaginian oligarchs, whose fingers he was prying out of the public purse, hated him for it. They sent secret letters to Rome accusing Hannibal of plotting a new war, of conspiring with Antiochus III, the Seleucid king in the east, to renew the fight against Rome. The Romans didn't need much convincing. They still feared Hannibal. Even in his 50s, running a civic administration, they feared him. And in 195 BCE, Roman envoys arrived in Carthage demanding that Hannibal be handed over for trial. Hannibal, hearing what was coming, didn't wait around. He fled the city that night, took a ship to Tyre, the ancient mother city of Carthage, and from there made his way to the court of Antiochus. He would spend the rest of his life in exile, wandering from court to court in the eastern Mediterranean, always one step ahead of Roman assassins and diplomats, until finally, in 183 BCE, cornered in Bithynia by Roman agents, he took poison rather than be captured. His last words, according to legend, were, "Let us relieve the Romans from their long anxiety, since they think it too tedious to wait for the death of an old man." A bitter end for the greatest enemy Rome ever faced. And now Carthage was alone, and Rome was watching, and time was running out. So Hannibal is gone, exiled, hunted, and eventually dead by his own hand in some obscure corner of Asia Minor. And Carthage, for the next 50 years, tries very hard to be the kind of quiet, well-behaved subject state that Rome wants it to be. And here is one of the great tragedies of history, because Carthage actually did quite well during this period. Really quite well. The indemnity payments, which had been designed to cripple the city financially for 50 years, were paid off ahead of schedule. Carthage even offered at one point to pay off the entire remaining balance in a single lump sum, which the Romans, they refused. Because if Carthage was that rich, that was itself a threat. The trade came back. The harbors filled up with ships again. The agricultural estates in the North African hinterland kept producing their grain and wine and olive oil. The population grew, new buildings went up. The city, though it had lost its overseas empire and its military independence, was clearly recovering. And that was the problem, because Rome had defeated Carthage twice. Rome had stripped away Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, and just about every meaningful piece of Carthaginian power. And still Carthage was there. Still Carthage was thriving. And there was a certain type of Roman senator who found this absolutely intolerable. The most famous of them, of course, was Marcus Porcius Cato, known as Cato the Elder or Cato the Censor. Cato had served as a young officer in the Second Punic War and had, apparently, formed a lifelong hatred of Carthage that time did nothing to soften. In fact, time made it worse. Because Cato had visited Carthage on a diplomatic mission in the 150s BCE, sent to arbitrate a dispute between Carthage and Massinissa, the Numidian king who was, we'll get to what he was doing in a moment. And what Cato saw in Carthage horrified him. Not ruins, not poverty, not a beaten and humbled ex-enemy, but a wealthy, bustling, prosperous city, full of merchants and ships and warehouses, growing more powerful with each passing year. Cato came home from that trip, according to the story, and started ending every speech he gave in the Senate, no matter what the actual topic of the speech was, with the same phrase, Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendum. Furthermore, I consider that Carthage must be destroyed. He would give a speech on grain prices and finish with Carthage must be destroyed. He would give a speech on some routine matter of provincial administration and finish with Carthage must be destroyed. He supposedly once brought a basket of fresh African figs into the Senate House and dumped them out on the floor, saying, "Look at these. They were picked 3 days ago in Carthage, and Carthage is that close to Rome. And Carthage, therefore, must be destroyed." This was a man on a mission. And the awful thing about ideological monomaniacs is that eventually they wear everyone else down. Eventually, the arguments they've been making for years become the arguments that people just repeat without thinking. And eventually they win. Now, while Cato was in Rome pounding his drum, there was someone else pounding his own drum in Africa. Massinissa. Remember him, the young Numidian king who had defected to Rome and provided the cavalry that destroyed Hannibal at Zama. Well, Massinissa was still alive, still king. In fact, he lived to be about 90 years old, remaining vigorous and active into extreme old age. And Massinissa had a very simple, very consistent policy for the 50 years after Zama. He wanted to absorb as much Carthaginian territory as possible. He kept nibbling at Carthage's borders. Every year, or every couple of years, he would seize some piece of territory, claim it had historically belonged to Numidia, and dare Carthage to do something about it. And Carthage, Carthage was in an impossible position, because the peace treaty with Rome said that Carthage could not wage war outside Africa without Roman permission. Some Romans, and this is important, chose to interpret that clause as meaning Carthage couldn't wage war at all without Roman permission, even in defense of its own homeland. So every time Massinissa grabbed another slice of Carthaginian territory, the Carthaginians would send envoys to Rome asking for permission to defend themselves, and Rome would appoint an arbitration commission, and the commission would arrive in Africa, and the commissioners would look at the situation, and they would side with Massinissa every single time, for decades. Because Massinissa was Rome's ally, and Carthage was Rome's defeated enemy, and Rome had no interest in restraining a loyal client king who was gradually doing what Rome itself wanted to see done, which was the slow strangulation of Carthaginian territory. This process went on for 40 years. 40 years of provocation and legal humiliation. 40 years of Carthage watching its ancestral lands being taken and being told by Roman arbitrators that this was fair and just. It was a masterclass in how to grind a weaker power into eventual desperation. And eventually, in 150 BCE, Carthage snapped. That year, Massinissa launched yet another invasion of Carthaginian territory. And Carthage, without waiting for a Roman arbitration commission that they knew perfectly well would rule against them, raised an army and marched out to fight him. It didn't go well. Massinissa was still an old wolf. He outmaneuvered the Carthaginian force, trapped it in an unfavorable position, and cut it to pieces. The Carthaginian army was destroyed, and Carthage, having technically violated the terms of the peace treaty by wagging war without Roman permission, had just given Rome exactly the excuse it needed. Cato and his allies in the Senate seized on the news. Carthage had broken its treaty. Carthage had shown itself unreliable. Carthage was a threat that could no longer be tolerated. And this time, when Cato said Carthage must be destroyed, the Senate agreed. In 149 BCE, Rome declared war on Carthage, and the Third Punic War, if you can call it a war at all, because it was much more of an execution than a war, began. Carthage, terrified, immediately tried to submit. Carthaginian envoys arrived in Rome offering unconditional surrender, offering to accept any terms Rome demanded, begging Rome not to attack. And Rome accepted the surrender. And then Rome kept moving the goalposts. First, Rome demanded 300 hostages from the leading families of Carthage. The Carthaginians handed them over. Then Rome demanded that Carthage surrender all its weapons and armor. Every sword, every spear, every arrow, every catapult, every scrap of body armor. The Carthaginians, hoping this would satisfy Rome, complied. Something like 200,000 suits of armor and 2,000 catapults were handed over to Roman officers, along with all the personal weapons of the citizens. Carthage was now, effectively, defenseless, and Rome, having gotten what it wanted, delivered its final demand. The Carthaginians must abandon their city. They must move 10 miles inland. Carthage itself, the great harbor city, the city that had stood for 600 years, must be destroyed. The Carthaginian envoys who received this demand collapsed on the spot. Some of them wept openly. Others begged the Roman consuls to reconsider. But there was no reconsideration to be had. Rome had decided that Carthage must cease to exist. And when the envoys returned home with the news, Carthage did something that nobody expected. Even Rome did not expect it, because Carthage had already surrendered its weapons. Carthage had already surrendered its hostages. Carthage had already submitted. Any sensible calculation would suggest that Carthage would just accept its fate and move inland. But Carthage did not do that. Carthage, when the terms became known, erupted in fury and despair. The mob rose. Roman sympathizers were murdered. The gates were closed. And the city, which had no army, no weapons, and no plausible hope of resistance, decided to fight. What followed was one of the most extraordinary sieges of the ancient world. And it lasted 3 years. 3 years, from 149 to 146 BCE. The Carthaginians, with nothing left to lose, transformed their city into a fortress and an armaments factory. They stripped the temples of their metal decorations to make weapons. Women cut off their hair to be used for catapult ropes, since human hair has just the right elasticity for torsion springs. Workshops sprang up in every quarter of the city, producing swords and spears and arrows and catapults day and night. Every citizen worked. Every citizen fought. Old men, women, children, they all found a role. The port was fortified, the walls were strengthened, and when the first Roman assault came, it was thrown back with heavy losses. The Romans hadn't expected this. They had expected to just walk in and put the population in chains. Instead, they found themselves besieging one of the most heavily fortified cities in the Mediterranean, defended by a population that literally had nothing to lose. The siege dragged on. The Roman armies suffered from disease in their camps. Their generals were mediocre. They couldn't seal off the city completely because Carthage had two harbors and the Romans couldn't block both. Small parties of Carthaginian raiders came and went at night. The war looked like it might drag on indefinitely, and Rome, growing embarrassed, needed a new commander, and the man they picked was, actually a rather remarkable choice. Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the Scipio who had defeated Hannibal at Zama. He was young, technically too young for the consulship by Roman law, but the Senate waived the requirements because Rome needed someone competent, and Scipio Aemilianus turned out to be competent indeed. He was cold, methodical, ruthless. He tightened the siege. He built a great mole across the entrance to the harbor, sealing it off. He constructed siege engines. He drilled his troops relentlessly. And in the spring of 146 BCE, he launched the final assault. The Romans broke into the outer defenses and then had to fight their way through the city street by street, house by house, for 6 days. 6 days of the most brutal urban warfare of the ancient world. The Carthaginians fought from the rooftops, threw stones and boiling oil and roof tiles down on the advancing legionaries. Every house had to be stormed. Every building had to be searched. The Romans set fire to buildings as they advanced to burn out the defenders, and the fires spread and consumed entire districts. On the 6th day, the survivors, some 50,000 people out of an original population that might have been 250,000, took refuge in the Biasa citadel and finally surrendered. They were led out of the city and sold into slavery. And then Scipio Aemilianus, standing on the smoking ruins of the greatest city in the western Mediterranean, is said to have wept. Wept openly, according to Polybius, who was actually there with him. Polybius, standing next to him, asked why he was crying at his own victory, and Scipio, according to Polybius, quoted a line from Homer, from the Iliad, about the fall of Troy. "A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall be slain." And Scipio said to Polybius that he was thinking about Rome, that everything that rises must fall, that someday some future conqueror would stand over the ruins of Rome the way he now stood over the ruins of Carthage. It's a striking moment. A moment of unusual philosophical clarity from a Roman general who had just committed what by modern standards would be called a war crime. But Scipio understood in that instant what he had done. He had ended a civilization. He had erased 600 years of history. And he understood, too, that history has a way of coming for everyone eventually. So Carthage is burning. The city that had once dominated the Western Mediterranean, the city that had produced Hannibal, the city that had rivaled Rome for supremacy over 2 centuries and 3 wars, is being consumed by fire. And the Romans, the Romans were not content just to destroy the city. They wanted to make sure it never rose again. The Roman Senate had issued specific instructions before the war ended. Carthage was to be leveled. Every building, every wall, every temple, every warehouse, every dock, nothing was to be left standing. The fires that had started during the fighting were allowed to burn for 17 days. When they finally died down, Roman work crews came in and finished the job with hammers and pickaxes. Every stone was pried loose. Every foundation was broken up. The site was surveyed by Roman priests who performed a ritual called the evocatio, formally inviting the gods of Carthage to abandon the city and take up residence in Rome instead. And then, according to a legend that may or may not be true, but which perfectly captures the spirit of the whole affair, the Romans salted the earth, sprinkled salt across the fields so that nothing would ever grow there again. Modern historians are skeptical of the salt story, since it would have required an impractical amount of salt to actually accomplish anything, and the earliest sources don't mention it. But the story stuck because it felt right, because it captured what Rome had done. Rome hadn't just defeated Carthage. Rome had erased it. And this is where we need to talk about what really happened after the destruction. Because destroying a city physically is one thing, but destroying a civilization is something else entirely. And Rome did both. The Library of Carthage, which by all accounts had been enormous, containing centuries of accumulated Punic literature, history, philosophy, religious texts, technical manuals, was largely destroyed. Some of it was burned in the fires. The rest was, according to Pliny the Elder, given to the allied Numidian kings, and Numidia had no particular interest in preserving Punic literature. So it just disappeared, vanished. The only Carthaginian book that the Roman Senate specifically ordered saved was Mago's agricultural treatise, which we mentioned earlier. Everything else, the poetry, the histories, the religious literature, the political documents, the personal letters, the trading records, all of it gone. When we try to reconstruct Carthaginian civilization today, we do it almost entirely through the words of their enemies, through Roman and Greek historians who had every reason to demonize them, and through archaeology, which can tell us about pottery and buildings and coins, but very little about what people actually thought or believed or felt. This is why we don't really know Carthage, not the way we know Athens or Rome or even Persia. We know it through the shadow it cast on other people. We know it through the propaganda of its enemies. We know that Carthaginians worshipped Baal, Hammon, and Tanit. We know they had a temple where, according to Greek and Roman sources, they sacrificed infants by burning them alive in bronze statues. And modern archaeology has actually confirmed that infant sacrifice did occur at Carthage, at least on some occasions, in a sacred precinct called the Tophet. Though scholars still argue about how common the practice was, and whether all the buried children were sacrifices, or whether many were simply infants who had died naturally and been buried in a sacred place. We know the Carthaginians were skilled sailors, brilliant merchants, capable soldiers. We know their language, a Semitic language closely related to Hebrew and Phoenician, kept being spoken in North Africa for centuries after the destruction of the city, gradually evolving into something the Romans called Neo-Punic. Saint Augustine, in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, could still hear Punic being spoken by the peasants of his North African diocese, 700 years after Carthage fell. Language, at least, survived longer than the stones, but the identity was gone. The idea of Carthage was gone, and that, I think, is what makes this story so haunting, because it's one of the few times in history where a great power really did succeed in erasing its rival. Usually, when one civilization conquers another, some cultural residue survives. The Greeks conquered Persia, but adopted enormous amounts of Persian culture. The Romans conquered Greece, but ended up basically becoming a Greek-speaking civilization for cultural purposes. The Arabs conquered Persia and still ended up preserving vast amounts of Persian literary tradition. But Carthage was different. Rome didn't just conquer Carthage. Rome tried to erase it from human memory, and to a startling degree, Rome succeeded. Because when we think of ancient civilizations today, we think of Egypt, Greece, Rome, Persia, Babylon. We don't think of Carthage, even though Carthage was, for centuries, one of the great powers of the ancient world. Even though Hannibal is one of the most famous names in military history, the civilization itself has become a footnote in someone else's story. It exists as a background against which the rise of Rome makes sense. And that, I think, was exactly what Rome wanted. There's a final chapter to the physical story, though, and it's worth mentioning. Because 100 years after Carthage was destroyed, the Romans came back and rebuilt on the same site. Not because they had regretted the destruction, but because the location was still, as it had always been, one of the best in the entire Mediterranean. Julius Caesar first ordered a Roman colony to be founded there. His successor Augustus followed through on the plan. And by the 2nd century CE, Roman Carthage was one of the largest cities in the Roman Empire, second only to Rome itself in the western half. It had a population of 500,000 people. It had aqueducts, amphitheaters, baths, temples. It was the capital of the Roman province of Africa Proconsularis. It produced grain that fed the Roman capital. It produced writers and thinkers who shaped early Christian theology, including Tertullian and Saint Augustine himself, who was bishop of the nearby city of Hippo. The physical city came back. But the Punic Carthage, the Carthage of Hamilcar and Hannibal, and the merchant princes and the priests of Tanit, that Carthage stayed dead. The people who lived in Roman Carthage were Romans or Romanized Africans or Christians in later centuries, or eventually Vandals and then Byzantines and then Arabs. But they were not Carthaginians. The chain of cultural transmission had been broken by Rome deliberately, and it could not be repaired. And there's one more twist to the story, one final piece of historical irony that I have to mention before we finish, because Roman Carthage, in the end, met its own destruction. In 439 CE, the city was captured by the Vandal king Gaiseric, and it became the capital of a Vandal kingdom that would exist for a century. Then in 533 CE, the Byzantine Empire under Justinian retook the city. And then in 698 CE, during the Arab conquest of North Africa, Carthage was captured by the Umayyad Caliphate. And the Arabs did to Roman Carthage what Rome had done to Punic Carthage. They destroyed it. They dismantled it. They used its stones to build a new city a few miles away called Tunis, which is still the capital of Tunisia today. And Carthage, the site itself, became a ruin. A quiet, weed-choked ruin sitting on the Bay of Tunis, visited occasionally by travelers and antiquarians. And there it remained for over 1,000 years, slowly being picked over by farmers and treasure hunters, until archaeologists began serious excavation in the 19th century. Today, you can visit Carthage. You can walk around the ruins of both the Punic city and the Roman city. You can stand on the Biasa hill, where Alyssa supposedly founded the city with her ox-hide trick. You can look out over the harbors and imagine the fleets that once packed them. And you can see in the museum the artifacts that have been recovered. Coins, pottery, statues, jewelry, funeral steels. Small silent objects testifying to a civilization that once was. But it's not enough. It's never enough. Because when we walk through the ruins of Athens or Rome, we hear echoes. We hear voices. We know the names of the people who lived there. We can read what they wrote. We can trace the arguments they had, the loves they felt, the fears they wrestled with. Carthage is quiet in a way that those other cities are not. Its people speak to us only through what their enemies said about them and through the mute testimony of the objects they left behind. It is, in a sense, the ancient world's greatest example of what happens when history is written by the winners, because Rome wrote the history of the Punic Wars. Rome wrote the history of the Mediterranean. Rome wrote the history of everything, essentially, for the next 1,000 years, and Rome had every reason to portray Carthage in a certain way, as treacherous, as cruel, as commercially obsessed, as barbaric, as deserving of destruction, and that portrayal has largely stuck. When people know anything about Carthage, they know that the Carthaginians sacrificed Barbies to Moloch and that they lost to Rome. Those two facts, and both of them are, in a sense, controlled by Roman narrative. And what do we take away from all of this? What is the lesson of Carthage, if a civilization's destruction can even be said to have a lesson? I think there are several, and they are all a little uncomfortable. The first is that even the greatest civilizations are fragile. Carthage lasted for 600 years. It survived catastrophic military defeats, brutal internal rebellions, plagues, famines, and betrayals. And then, in 3 years of intense siege, it was gone. Utterly. Forever. Nothing in history is permanent. Not power, not wealth, not culture, not memory itself. The second lesson is that geography is destiny, at least partly. Carthage was born because of where it was at the choke point of the Mediterranean, and it died because of where it was, close enough to Rome to be seen as a permanent threat, but not so close that Rome couldn't afford the patience to methodically dismantle it. If Carthage had been on the far side of the world, or if Rome had been a Baltic power instead of a Mediterranean one, the whole story would have been different. The third lesson is the one Scipio Aemilianus understood as he wept over the burning city. That victory is never final either. The Rome that destroyed Carthage would itself, eventually, be destroyed. The Roman Empire in the West collapsed in the 5th century CE. Rome, the city, was sacked repeatedly. The civilization that Rome built survived in fragments, in memory, in language, in law. But it too is gone. And so are the Vandals who came after, and the Byzantines who came after them, and the Umayyad Caliphate that took Carthage from the Byzantines. Everyone falls. That is the one iron law of history. And so we come to the end of our story. 10 parts on Carthage, from its Phoenician origins on the coast of Lebanon, through its rise as a merchant empire, through the great wars with Rome, through the tragedy of Hannibal, through the terrible siege of 149 to 146 BCE, and finally through the erasure that Rome imposed on its rival. Thank you for coming with me on this journey. I know Carthage is not the most famous of the ancient civilizations. It doesn't have the glamour of Egypt or the intellectual reputation of Greece. But it deserves to be remembered, not just as Rome's enemy, but as a great civilization in its own right. A civilization of sailors and merchants, of poets and priests, of gardeners and philosophers, whose voices we can no longer hear, but whose shadow still stretches across the Mediterranean, from the ruins on the Bay of Tunis to the alphabet you're reading right now. Because remember, the alphabet came from Phoenicia, and Carthage was Phoenicia's greatest daughter. In the end, they gave us the letters. That's something at least. That's something that Rome could not take away, no matter how thoroughly they tried to erase everything else. Good night, and farewell for now.